Thank you very much. My teachers at Oxford were often going on about the fact that the furthest east that any Orientalist needed to go was Leipzig. And the reason for this was that it was considered that people studying the East didn't really need to go there. You could study the people and the place from a distance, and particularly in a library. And it just so happens that Leipzig is the most easterly of the great European Orientalist libraries. But I'm not that kind of scholar. I've had a lot of adventures in my life, and I've had a lot of journeys. And the most exciting of these, in many ways, and this is really rather surprising and astonishing, was in Africa. Now, why should this be surprising? It's surprising because I am a student of Jewish studies, and particularly remote Jewish communities throughout the world. And whereas, of course, there were Jews in places like Europe and the Caucasus and Central Asia, and of course on the Silk Route as far as China, there were no Jews in pre-modern times in Black Africa, with the exception of one or two references in very, very dodgy medieval texts suggesting that there might be some lost cities and the occasional Jewish king somewhere in the heart of the unknown continent. This is how it happened. I was asked to go to South Africa to give a lecture at the University of Witwatersrand, and it was a hall a bit like this. The place was full of very well-dressed, affluent-looking white South Africans, and they listened very attentively, sitting in their comfortable, well-upholstered chairs to what I had to say. But at the back of the hall, there was quite a large group of very poorly dressed black people, shoeless, but they were wearing little black skull caps. And after my lecture, I went across, introduced myself, and we started to chat. And they explained that they were members of the Lemba tribe. And then, to my great astonishment again, they said that they were black Jews who'd come hundreds or perhaps thousands of years before into Africa from somewhere in the north and from a city that they referred to as Sena. And they had a kind of epic poem which they started chanting to me, and it went something like this: "We are the white men who came from Sena. We crossed Pusela. We crossed the sea. We came to Africa. We rebuilt Sena. We are the white men who came from Sena. We followed the star. We carried the ark." Pretty amazing song. And then they said that they would like me to go and visit them. And they lived 6 or 7 hours north of where we were, right up against the frontier with Zimbabwe, in little thatched villages. And off I went and spent a little time there, several days. And at night, I would sit out with the old men, and they would tell me stories of their journey across Africa, of their Jewish customs, of their circumcision rites, and their ritual slaughter of animals. And most astonishingly, they told me how their priests, because there was a priestly clan, how their priests carried something like the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders on poles right across the continent. Well, it was a pretty amazing story, and I was amazed as a Jewish scholar that I didn't know about it. There is no more historically conscious people in the world than the Jews, and yet in the whole realm of Jewish scholarship, there was no mention of these people and these remarkable stories. So I felt that I absolutely had to find out whether these people were genuinely Jewish, in the first place, and I wondered if this was possible, and I also needed to find out where their lost city of Sena was. I decided to try and do this, and a few months later, I started off on a journey which took me right across Africa, and the idea of the journey, in a way, was to follow the oral tradition of this tribe in reverse, because the oral tradition was extremely complete and very precise, and it worked as an amazingly good roadmap. And so off I set, and it took me through South Africa and Zimbabwe, and then Malawi, Tanzania, and finally into Mozambique, and then I got to the sea. And then the clues simply dried up. There was nothing there that could help me find the original Sena, which was somewhere across this sea, somewhere in the north. But while I was on the coast, I found near the mouth of the Zambezi River some great monumental chunks of stone. And a few days later in Zanzibar, I was rootling around in a library, came across some old Arabic texts, and I was able to deduce that these stones were the last remnant of a city which had existed there by the name of Sayuna. Now, I was pretty sure that this Sayuna would have been the second Sena of the Lemba. They left Sena, they crossed the sea, came to Africa and rebuilt this Sena, Sayuna. But it also occurred to me that this Sayuna was the same as the Arabic for the word Zion, like an African Zion. And when I thought that, a cold shiver went down my spine. It was a very exciting moment. But still, I had no way at that point of trying to discover the original Sena. And it was only the following year, when I was in the Yemen, in South Arabia, doing a book on the Jews of the Yemen, that I had another clue. And this happened by chance. I was having lunch with a Muslim cleric in Tarim, a holy city in the Hadramaut, which is that valley that crosses right across South Arabia. And I told him what I'd been doing. I told him the story of the Lemba, the story of their crossing from Sena, crossing Pusela, rebuilding Sena, and so on. And the cleric clapped his hands together, and he said, "I think I've got a hunch. I think I know where your Sena is." And he told me that he'd heard that right at the end of the Wadi, going towards Mehra and Oman, there was indeed a lost city, or the remnants of a lost city in the desert, partially covered by sands. And there was a local tradition that when the original population had to leave because the dam there broke, they went to Africa. So I jumped into a Land Rover. A few days later, I was there, discovered this lost city of Sena, and talking to the Bedouin tribes who lived in the vicinity, I was astonished to discover that their tribal names were exactly the same as the clan names of the Lemba tribe, right on the other side of Africa, thousands and thousands of miles away. So this seemed to me to be a reasonable indication that this indeed was the tribe. This was really the lost city of this tribe. And then they told me that when they'd left the city, when the population had left the city, they followed a valley called the Masila down to the sea, and then they took a boat which took them to Africa. And I thought, well, maybe the Masila is the Pusela of their oral tradition. But still, it was close. I wasn't entirely satisfied that I had the proof. It wasn't exactly a smoking gun. So I had the idea that maybe what seemed to be pretty impossible by regular means might be made possible by using genetics. And so I went back to London, and I had quite a number of geneticist friends, told them what the problem was historically, and we agreed to do a project together. And so we did a big collect in the Hadramaut, collected a lot of data, and then we went to Africa, did control collects, and a huge collection from the Lemba tribe itself, took the data back to London, into the lab, and a couple of weeks later they called me in, we sat down, we looked at the information that was coming out, and to my great gratification and excitement, there was a real overlap between the population of the Lemba and the population of the eastern Hadramaut. Well, this is pretty exciting because it seemed to me that I had therefore proved that where the original Sena of the Lemba was. Good. I had also proved that their tradition, which said that they had come from the north, presumably from Arabia, was true. But there was the other question. Were they Jewish? Now, a couple of years before, I'd collaborated on another paper which had to do with the Jewish priesthood. Now, a Jewish priest is called Cohen. Everybody here knows somebody called Mr. Cohen. Now, Mr. Cohen, in theory, would be descended from the original priests who 2,500 years ago officiated in the temple in Jerusalem. That was the idea. So we did a big experiment. We collected many Cohens from all over the world, and what we discovered really was a corroboration of this tradition, that over half of the Cohen population descended from a particular individual, and that particular individual lived somewhere in the area of Palestine, Israel, 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago is more or less the time when Moses lived, and it was Moses' brother, Aaron, who was the founder of the priesthood. So this was a pretty neat piece of research, and a particular haplotype, a particular signature, a family signature of the Cohens was known to exist and did exist. So then, when we started looking more closely at the stuff coming out of the Lemba DNA, in one of the clans, their priestly clan, you remember the clan that carried something like the Ark over Africa, what did we discover? We discovered that the same proportion of that clan had this rare haplotype as did Cohens throughout the world. Again, this was a pretty extraordinary moment. So it was fair to say that the origins of the Lemba were indeed Jewish. We knew where Sena was, and we knew how they got there more or less. The implications of this piece of research were quite considerable. They were certainly significant for the Lemba people, because when they were first discovered or come across in the 19th century by British colonists, they were forced pretty much to become Christians, like everybody else in the area. As soon as the DNA research came through, they stopped, in many cases, being Christian. They abandoned the church and they started creating synagogues. So in terms of their identity, the genetic research was massively influential. And so it seemed to me that this kind of research, at least in my area, was possible of delivering not only a kind of historical authenticity, but also a sort of social justice. In another case, I had been working with a tribe of so-called maybe Jews, small black men who live in and around Mumbai in Western India, who'd always been absolutely on the fringe of anything Jewish, and nobody took their claim to be Jewish in any way seriously. And we did a big DNA-based piece of research on this group, and we discovered that indeed their claim to be of an Israelite population was true. And the night that this was revealed, there'd been a huge article in the Times of India the day before. The people spilled out into the street, and they were singing, and they were dancing, and they were rejoicing all night. As one of them said to me afterwards, it was as if the Messiah had come. They felt a sense of vindication, a sense of authenticity, which they'd never had before. One of the other impacts was that this kind of technology and this way of looking at history spread all over the world, of course, through the internet. And one day I was in my hotel room in Sydney. I was lecturing at the University of Sydney. The telephone goes and somebody is calling from Papua New Guinea, and he describes himself as being the spiritual head of a particular tribe called the Gogodala, who live in the western part of Papua New Guinea in the Fly River estuary. And he explained to me that he'd seen on the internet the stuff that I'd done on the Lemba, and he wanted me to prove for the world that his tribe in the Fly Swamp were also of Jewish ancestry. And the following day he arrived from Papua New Guinea, and he came into the hotel room bearing a large black hat. And he plucked out of the hat a hair, and inside the hat there were another 500. He'd taken a hair from 500 members of his tribe, and he wanted me to take the hair back to London so DNA could be extracted from the roots. Well, in the event, not very surprisingly, the research that I subsequently did some 10 years ago on this particular hypothesis didn't prove to be satisfactory to the Jewish claims of the Gogodala tribe. But I found it was utterly fascinating that a tribe which until 1950 had been cannibalistic and which was still largely hunter-gatherer should by 2000 and whatever it was be using the internet to invoke genetics to try and prove an Israelite identity. And so I've been following their progress since. And despite the negative DNA work, they're still quite convinced that they're Jewish, and their practices of Judaism increase as the years go on. So what does that prove? It tends to prove, anyway, that positive identifications through DNA have a very, very big impact upon identity, as we have in the case of the Lemba, and as we have in the case of the group from Mumbai in Western India. In the case of the Gogodala, the results were somewhat negative, but they didn't seem to particularly impact. Over the last, let's say, 13 years, historians have been handed a new tool of research. It's a very powerful tool of research. In the past, the study of history was always in the hands of a kind of elite. But now, with the history book that everybody carries in their DNA, which is a very kind of democratic kind of history, whole new worlds are going to open up, both in terms of the way that we view history, and finally, I think, about the way that we view ourselves. Thank you.